Just how long does it take to rebuild a society that just spent 250 years actively enslaving generations of its population and creating systems and institutions rooted in white supremacy? 10 years, according to Congress. Reconstruction only lasted a decade. 10 years was all it took to rehabilitate the relationship between North and South and integrate people of color seamlessly into American society. Except that didn't happen, because 10 years is not enough time. It would take generations of concerted effort on everyone's part to break down the societal and institutional racism that had been built up for centuries. But by 1876, most white Americans were like, we're tired. Why are we still talking about slavery? Wasn't that like forever ago? Ironically, people are still saying that today, just as the creators of the 1619 Project, but I digress. So why did Congress end the formal era of Reconstruction, meaning the era when they were directly in control of Southern governments and elections, before former Confederate states were fully readmitted back into the Union? Well, Reconstruction was expensive, and white Southerners were sick of having the military running things in their backyard. It didn't help that we were in a post-war economic depression, and Ulysses S. Grant was not quite as good as a president than he was as a general. Grant's administration was plagued with corruption, and most Americans just wanted to move on. I say most Americans. Most white Americans wanted to move on. Black Americans desperately wanted the government to do more to protect their hard-won rights, especially after the Supreme Court had been slowly limiting the scope of Congress's power over radical Reconstruction. So most people's attention turned to the presidential election of 1876. This highly contested race was between Samuel Tilden, the Democrat, and Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican. Remember, this is still the party of Lincoln. And it all came down to disputed election returns from 3 states: Louisiana, South Carolina, and can you guess the third? Florida. Oh my God, Florida. You've been screwing up elections for 150 years? Get it together. Ironically, those 3 states were also the only ones left with full Reconstruction-era Republican governments in charge. Democratic candidate Tilden was just 1 electoral vote away from winning the presidency, but the vote was so close that Congress created a commission to determine the outcome. It's way more complicated than this, but yada yada yada, a secret agreement was struck. Southern Democrats would support the Republican candidate, Hayes, for president, if Congress agreed to withdraw all federal troops from the South. So thanks to the Compromise of 1877, the year President Hayes took office, Democrats regained control of the South, Samuel Tilden was robbed of the presidency, and Reconstruction was officially over. You know, I'm starting to think Americans aren't great at this whole compromise thing. So now, federal oversight in the South was back to pre-war standards, leaving Black Americans newly freed, but kind of on their own. Southern states quickly began finding loopholes in the new 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and the South entered the Jim Crow era. With federal troops gone, elections went back into the hands of white Southerners. So the 15th Amendment said that, quote, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." But the right to vote could be denied for other reasons. And states and local governments typically determine their own election procedures, so they used bureaucracy to effectively disenfranchise Black men. States began to put in place a variety of prerequisites for voting. For example, maybe you had to own property, or you had to pay a poll tax, or you had to prove a certain level of education by taking ridiculously problematic literacy tests. Seriously, I took 2 of the Jim Crow era literacy tests, and I failed both. And keep in mind that all of these procedures were monitored and administered by just regular white Southerners. So let's say that a Black man did own property, he could afford to pay the poll tax, and he passed the literacy test. There was still the possibility that he could be denied the right to vote by some arcane or just made up on the spot rule. Or his vote could be thrown away as soon as he cast it. Or maybe he knows that the man in charge of local elections is also a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and so he'd just rather not put himself in harm's way by attempting to vote in the first place. All of these tactics were used to make it incredibly difficult or impossible for Black men to vote. But it was the kind of thing that on paper was technically colorblind, so the federal government wouldn't re-involve itself in the South. And a Northerner might read about the poll tax in the news and say, well, I guess that seems fair, right? It costs money for local governments to run elections, so yeah, just pay the poll tax and then vote. But they don't realize that the poll tax might be a significant portion of a Black family's monthly pay, or that many Black Americans were already already unfairly in serious debt to white landowners thanks to sharecropping. Not to mention that they might just not be willing to give up hard-earned money on principle, since white men often aren't having to pay the same poll tax. And they have a pretty good suspicion that their vote might not be counted anyway. How could states get around making poor, landless white men being disenfranchised in the same way as black men? Well, there are lots of examples, but the most egregious of the Jim Crow voting rules was the grandfather clause. In many states, voters could be exempted from all of these other requirements if they, or a parent or grandparent, had been able to vote before 1867. Because a lot of these Jim Crow restrictions might also hurt poor white voters, and the Democrats didn't want that. So they just said, okay, if your grandfather could vote, then you can vote too, without having to pay a tax or own property or whatever. Obviously, most black Southerners' parents or grandparents were, enslaved, so they couldn't vote. And under this rule, that meant that their own children and grandchildren and so on wouldn't be able to vote for the same reason. And this is where we get the phrase grandfathered in, by the way. The Jim Crow era wasn't just about voting and political exclusion. It was also about societal exclusion. And I'm talking about segregation. Across the South, separate facilities popped up for white and black citizens. And keep in mind, this happened pretty easily, considering that black facilities hadn't really existed before the Civil War. So all antebellum institutions were kind of already whites only. Logistically, it was pretty easy to just say, okay, I guess we have to build a black school now, instead of considering, I don't know, letting black kids go to the school that already existed. Just an idea. And this segregation was upheld by the Supreme Court in a uniquely terrible decision called Plessy versus Ferguson. The case centered on Homer Plessy, a man from New Orleans who was 7/8 white and 1/8 black. He was arrested for sitting in a whites-only train car, and he sued all the way up to the Supreme Court. And you might be wondering, why is it relevant that he was 7/8 white, meaning 7 of his 8 great-grandparents were white? Well, black civil rights groups intentionally chose someone who was as close to whiteness as possible to test these segregation laws. The idea was pessimistically to choose a face for the movement that white people could see themselves in and would maybe have more sympathy for. But it was also to show just how ridiculous the laws were that punished Americans for having 1 drop of black blood, which was a real legal principle at the time. If you had any black heritage, you were legally black. Plessy's case went up to the Supreme Court, and they ruled that creating separate but equal facilities divided by race was a totally okay thing to do constitution-wise. And they justified this decision by arguing that there's nothing in the state law that requires that one facility be better or worse than the other. Direct quote: "If there is a badge of inferiority, it is solely because the colored race choose to put that construction upon it." Basically, the court said, it's not our fault your schools are worse. If you want black schools to be as good as white schools, just work harder and make them better yourself. Great, thanks, that's helpful. So this is all basically what people mean when they talk today about institutionalized racism. Remember in an earlier episode when I used the metaphor of Black Americans being shackled inside a prison built by colonial statutes, societal assumptions, and laws. The walls of the prison, no access to decent education or job opportunities, housing discrimination, disenfranchisement, all of those walls are still up. And sure, Black Americans have been emancipated. They aren't chained to the walls. And sure, some Black people do make it out, but the vast majority are still inside, unable to step out and successfully challenge the status quo. And that brings us to the last element of the post-Civil War South: violence, mob justice, and the KKK. You see, even if Black Americans did technically have opportunities, or they could pass the literacy test and pay the poll tax, there was still the fear of retribution and consequences outside the law. Let's be very clear. Southern police forces evolved literally out of slave catching squads that were created in the fugitive slave era before the Civil War. And remember that law enforcement does just that. It enforces the existing laws. So if the existing laws are racist, then law enforcement as a whole is also... But many white people took the enforcement of Jim Crow into their own hands. If Black people didn't act the way they believed they should act, they were intimidated, punished, or killed. Lynchings became the preferred method of extra-legal execution by mobs, often led by police officers on their day off and other respected white community members. I recently found a fascinating primary source that I want to share with you. It's the writings of a Chinese journalist named Liang Qichao. He traveled to the United States in 1903 and wrote about what he saw. This is such a crazy, unique primary source. Keep in mind, this is just a few decades after the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. We'll get there. It had banned Chinese people from immigrating permanently to the United States. And I say this just to highlight the irony that at the time that the US saw Chinese people as inferior and uncivilized, we were treating our own people barbarically in the eyes of a Chinese visitor. Anyway, in his travel journal, he writes about all sorts of things, from JP Morgan and life in New York City to social issues like poverty and corruption. But I want to read you his description of lynching, a true contemporary outside observer attempting to explain this process to the world. Americans have an unofficial form of punishment, known as lynching, with which to treat blacks. Such a phenomenon is unimaginable among civilized countries. It started with a farmer named Lynch because he had been offended by a black. He suspended him from a tree to wait for the police officers to arrive, but the black man died before they came. So his name has been used for this ever since. Recently, the common practice is burning people to death. Whenever a black has committed an offense, a mob will be directly gathered and burn him without going through the courts. Had I only been told about this and not been to America myself, I would not have believed that such cruel and inhuman acts could be performed in broad daylight in the 20th century. During the 10 months I was in America, I counted no less than 10 odd accounts of this strange business in the newspapers. At first I was shocked, but have become accustomed to reading about it and no longer consider it strange. This behavior, the institutionalization, criminalization, and murder of black citizens, was not normal. It was not a product of its time. Other people around the world were horrified by what was going on in the US. And in fact, future leaders like Adolf Hitler and the white government of apartheid South Africa are going to literally study the Jim Crow South, in addition to our treatment of indigenous Americans, by the way, as a guide for their own racist projects. Now, the group most associated with violence in the Jim Crow era is the Ku Klux Klan. The KKK actually gained the most traction during the Reconstruction era, as they operated in secret to oppose federal involvement in the South and to intimidate black men out of exercising their newly protected rights. The group was founded in 1865, the year the Civil War ended, by Confederate veterans as a social club in Pulaski, Tennessee. Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest was chosen as the first leader, or Grand Wizard. The whole organization is full of ridiculous mystical names. It's like a D&D group full of sociopaths. Now, they weren't the only white supremacist organization, but they were the most prominent. By 1870, the KKK had branches in nearly every southern state, but even at its height, the Klan did not have a very well-organized structure or clear leadership. In many ways, they were like a precursor to modern terrorist organizations that operate independently, but are inspired and motivated by an overarching common ideology. During the Reconstruction era, the Klan focused on intimidating Republican voters, especially during the presidential election of 1868. In Kansas, over 2,000 murders were committed in connection with that election. In Georgia, the number of threats and beatings was even higher, and in Louisiana, 1,000 Black Americans were killed as the election neared. In those three states, Democrats, again, the party of states' rights in the former Confederacy, won decisive victories at the polls. Later on, Democratic leadership would try to paint the KKK as a group of mostly poor white, but in reality, the membership crossed class lines, from farmers and laborers to lawyers, congresspeople, doctors, and ministers. Ironically, the actions of the KKK initially backfired, as many outside the South realized that there needed to be more protections for newly emancipated freedmen. Like the 15th Amendment giving black men the right to vote was passed partially as a rebuke of Klan violence. But long term, the Klan got their goal of white supremacy when Democrats took back control of the state after Reconstruction in so-called Redeemer governments. Counterintuitively, the KKK lost traction when Reconstruction ended, but only because its members were mostly able to just operate legitimately as elected officials, businessmen, and police officers back in charge of law enforcement now that federal troops were withdrawn from the South. You didn't need a hood when your racism was legally sanctioned and rewarded. A quick side note before we go. Who was Jim Crow? Where did that name come from? He was actually a fictional theater character that was created by a white actor named Thomas Rice earlier in the 19th century. Rice had been inspired by folk stories of a black trickster, also named Jim Crow, who had been popular in the South. But this Jim Crow character was played by a white man in blackface. He was basically a caricature of racist white ideas about Black Americans and their culture. He was always dressed in rags, and he was witty and cunning, someone to be wary of, but ultimately an ignorant, unskilled field hand. By the 1830s, the term Jim Crow was just being generally used as an offensive term toward Black people. So when people began describing the various laws and impediments put up around the South, they were nicknamed the Jim Crow laws. And that, viewers, is one of the many reasons that white people shouldn't wear blackface. I didn't think I needed to clarify that in the 21st century, but according to the internet, I do. So the Civil War ended. There was a brief period of rapid social and political advancement, especially for Black men. And then white people got tired, went home, and the South redeemed its white supremacist governments, while the North turned its attention back to its own cities and burgeoning industry. What's the government gonna do with all these soldiers sitting around without a civil war to fight or a Reconstruction government to protect? Maybe we should look into our Western territory and finally get a handle on all those indigenous tribes. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe, and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.